The horizon lay muted under the gray sweep of early morning fog, each wave crest blurred into the next. Jonas Marlow leaned against the edge of his small skiff, fingers tracing the coarse rope that bound the nets he had laid the evening before. The wind carried a faint brine, mixed with the scent of coal smoke drifting from distant chimneys along the cliffs. His eyes followed the rhythm of the tide, cataloging the rise and fall with the precision of a man who had worked these waters for decades. He had noticed it over the past several weeks, the regular patrol boats that slipped along the coastal edge, maintaining a mechanical regularity that no weather, tide, or fog could interrupt. Steam hissed faintly from their boilers, blending with the morning mist, and the wakes behind them created subtle patterns on the water's surface. Jonas had begun to track these wakes, noting the direction, speed, and intervals, scribbling small notations into a leather-bound journal. The patrols were never haphazard. They seemed to anticipate each movement along the coast, each skiff departure, each drift of a buoy. Smoke columns, when visible, marked their positions, and sound traveled differently over the water. He could hear the low thrum of engines before any visual cue. Even the mechanical clank of a hatch or the scrape of an anchor provided him with information. He had begun to build a mental map, triangulating the patrol's usual routes, speed ranges, and observation angles. A foghorn bellowed in the distance, muffled but precise. Jonas recorded the time and direction, comparing it to prior mornings. His own routine, the untangling of nets, the inspection of lines, the careful adjustment of bait, was interrupted as he became aware of the patrol boat's subtle responsiveness. When he adjusted a floating net for current direction, he noted a vessel shifting slightly off its course. When a local gull startled and wheeled overhead, a patrol boat's bow swung toward its flight. These were not coincidences. He crouched in the skiff, pencil in hand, observing the rising sun's light glancing off the water. The distant silhouettes of the patrols remained partially obscured, black shapes in the gray mist. Yet even through the fog, he could see patterns, telltale movements of crew, a flash of a lantern, the faint outline of rigging. Over days, he had begun to see the anticipatory timing of these boats. They were tracking more than just the coastline. They were aware of human activity, even the minor, mundane movements of local fishermen. Jonas' hand hovered over the journal. He noted each observation with the same methodical detachment he applied to his nets. Every pattern, every echo of an engine, every deviation in wake or smoke was cataloged. He did not speculate emotionally. He recorded. Yet a small unease threaded through him as he realized the implications. Someone was studying the small routines of coastal life with meticulous attention. A low splash disturbed the nearshore water, and a patrol boat adjusted its course. Jonas leaned closer, whispering to himself as he tracked its movements against the rising tide. They know these waters too well. The realization settled in like the morning fog. This was not routine patrol. The movements of the vessels, the precision of their course, the attention to minor changes along the shore, all indicated surveillance beyond normal protocol. Jonas Marlow, solitary fisherman, had become aware that these waters were not entirely his own. The game had begun, and the rules were yet to be revealed. The morning mist clung to the jagged black rocks along the shore, softening their edges into blurred silhouettes. Jonas Marlow crouched low at the waterline, fingers tracing the faint ridges left in the sand by the outgoing tide. Each groove, each ripple, carried a story of motion, currents, wind, and human activity. He bent over the sand with the methodical detachment of a surveyor, noting the angles of wave reflections and the subtle shifts in foam lines as the tide crept outward. From the distance, the patrol boats traced familiar arcs across the gray water, their engines muffled by fog. Jonas had begun to catalog their courses, comparing day-to-day variations in speed and heading. He observed the wakes stretching behind them like ink strokes, following patterns only discernible to someone who had spent decades reading the language of water. Each shift in the tide and wind changed the way these trails behaved, and Jonas had learned to interpret them, which marks indicated a vessel moving deliberately along its route, and which suggested attention to unseen activity onshore. He traced the path of a recently passed patrol boat, noting the angle at which it cut across a shallow cove. For several days, he had observed the vessel's departures from the main channel, consistently aligning their bow with the tidal curves. But today, a discrepancy drew his attention. One boat slowed near an isolated stretch of cliff where no mooring post existed, its hull rocking gently against invisible currents. Jonas squinted through the fog, adjusting for distance and haze, and marked the pause in his journal. This was no navigational error. A deliberate halt where no patrol had reason to linger suggested surveillance of the coastline itself. As he continued cataloging the wakes, he observed minor anomalies in patrol timing. Vessels arrived minutes earlier or later than expected along stretches of open water. Even small changes, a puff of smoke, a sudden angle change, told him that someone was assessing not only the tides but also human movement along the shore. Jonas adjusted the position of his own skiff slightly, testing whether the patrols would respond to the smallest visual cue. There was a subtle shift in the far-off bow, confirming his suspicion. Their vigilance extended to civilian routines as well. He bent closer to the sand, following the traces of his own boat from yesterday. The residual foam, unevenly dissipated by the tide, allowed him to anticipate the timing of each patrol's return. Jonas combined these environmental markers with prior observations of the patrol's schedule, constructing a mental map of movement patterns over the course of hours. Every detail, the curve of a wave, the thickness of a wake, the angle of a reflected lantern, added to a precise, predictive understanding of enemy navigation. Then, something caught his attention along the cliffs. A shadow flitted across a ledge, barely distinguishable from the gray rocks, but its movement was deliberate. Jonas froze, recording its position in his mind. The patrol boat anchored below, seemingly unaware of the cliff above, while the shadow lingered just long enough to suggest observation rather than casual passage. He noted the implications. Someone was not only monitoring the waters, but potentially the shoreline and anyone moving along it. Jonas stepped back from the tide, scanning the horizon once more. The patrols continued their rigid, predictable paths, but now the environment itself, the sand, the tidal marks, the wind patterns, had become his instrument. He could read the movements of the enemy as precisely as he read the lines left by the sea, and he understood that these observations were the first layer of a deeper strategy to protect his waters. As the fog thickened, softening the waves into a monochrome wash, Jonas whispered under his breath. The shadow along the cliffs hinted at something, or someone, beyond his immediate comprehension. For the first time, the predictability of the patrols was complicated by the presence of another unknown watcher, and he knew the next step would require not just observation, but anticipation. The morning fog clung low to the black rocks, the waves retreating to reveal a narrow strip of glistening sand. Jonas Marlow crouched at the waterline, eyes tracing the subtle ripples that marked the submerged channel running parallel to the cliff edge. Over the past several days, he had methodically measured depth with a weighted line, noting where the sandbank dipped just enough to conceal a hidden net without threatening the passage of his own small skiff. Each measurement he recorded in meticulous sketches, marking the gradient, tidal shifts, and the timing of high and low tides. He observed the currents with the same precision he had applied to patrol wakes. Even slight variations in water speed indicated areas where the channel would draw objects, small logs, driftwood, or eventually, the hulls of enemy vessels, into predictable paths. Jonas bent low to the water, releasing a small decoy float tethered to a light line, letting it drift within the channel's subtle flow. Its movement traced the path the net would need to intercept, drifting just under the surface, invisible to any casual observer. The rocks along the channel provided natural camouflage, their dark forms breaking the line of sight from patrol boats moving offshore. Jonas considered the angle of the morning sun and the evening shadows, noting how reflections on the water might expose an anomaly. He tested placement with small stones, simulating disturbances a passing ship might produce. Every detail, from the way foam clung to a rock to the subtle color variations in the surf, was cataloged for future reference. Yet the channel was not entirely predictable. One night, a sudden shift in the currents had moved the decoy float nearly a meter from its expected location. Jonas had recalculated, adjusting net lines and anchor points to compensate for the variability, ensuring that even a minor shift in tide would not compromise the trap. His fingers traced the grooves in the sand where the float had dragged, imagining how a vessel's hull might interact with the net lines, and how the tension would need to be carefully balanced to entangle a ship without breaking under strain. The sound of the surf was muted, absorbed by the fog and jagged cliffs. Jonas's attention sharpened to every subtle pull on the tethered decoy. He held the line taut, eyes scanning the horizon and the dark water, calculating the force necessary to trigger the net's entanglement while leaving no trace for casual observation. It was a delicate equilibrium, requiring patience and a precise understanding of the channel's hydrodynamics. Then, unexpectedly, the float tugged. A small, sudden pull that jolted his arm against the line. Jonas froze, scanning the water, the mist, the cliffs. The tug was too deliberate to be a wave or a drifting log. He pulled gently, and the line quivered again. He could not see what had caught it, but the tactile feedback was unmistakable. The hidden channel, though ideal in theory, now held an unpredictable variable. He knelt at the edge of the surf, documenting the tug in his journal, noting current velocity, float position, and tidal height. The complexity of the environment, the shifting currents, the concealed channel, the submerged obstacles, meant that every small test was critical. Jonas understood that this early anomaly, though minor, could signify either a flaw in his calculations or an unknown factor introduced by nature itself. As he stood, gaze fixed on the fogged horizon, he whispered under his breath, "It moves differently than I expect." The decoy float bobbed gently, hinting at both the potential of his plan and the lurking uncertainty he would need to master. The hidden channel, carefully mapped and prepared, had revealed its first secret, and with it, the first real tension in Jonas's endeavor. The night hung heavy over the fog-choked bay, the black water reflecting only faint halos from the lantern's tied to Jonas Marlow's small fishing skiff. He had prepared for this first trial with meticulous care, the hidden channel mapped, net anchors secured, and a single decoy float tied lightly to the vessel. His movements were deliberate, measured, each or stroke sending minimal wake, designed to simulate a passing enemy craft without alerting the patrol to the presence of an observer. Jonas kept to the shadow of the cliffs, positioning himself so that he could monitor the patrols while remaining unseen. He squinted through the fog, noting the silvery reflections of distant searchlights bouncing across the waves. Each light's sweep outlined the hulls of the German patrol vessels, their positions predictable but unerringly precise. He traced their courses on a small chart, timing their patrol loops and noting acceleration or slight hesitation in response to wave patterns. As the skiff glided along the channel, Jonas observed how the decoy float interacted with the water, testing the subtle current pulls against the lines that would soon support the hidden net. Every motion was recorded in his journal. The angle of the vessel's drift, the tension required to maintain course, and the exact moments when the float passed key points where enemy ships were likely to navigate. The goal was to provoke the patrol into reacting naturally, revealing their tactics without compromising his position. It was during this trial that the first insight struck. One patrol vessel altered its speed almost imperceptibly, adjusting to match the decoy's movement, as if guided by some preternatural intuition. Jonas noted the precise distance between the decoy and the vessel, timing the seconds it took to close gaps or respond to changes in course. The crew's precision was remarkable, far closer than any ordinary monitoring of civilian craft. Every adjustment was calculated, efficient, and unmistakably deliberate. The fog muffled the usual ambient noise, lapping waves, the creak of the skiff, distant foghorns. In this silence, the mechanical hum of the patrol engines stood out sharply. Jonas recorded their RPMs, noting how throttle changes corresponded to adjustments in position. Even the angle of the vessel's hulls against the tide revealed how the crews compensated for currents while maintaining surveillance. It was an orchestration of timing, positioning, and observation, knowledge that would prove critical when the hidden net was finally deployed. Then the moment of alarm came. One patrol boat broke slightly from the formation, turning directly toward the decoy. Its bow cut through the silver-black waves, maintaining a precise alignment with the skiff. Jonas froze behind the protective rocks, heart steady but mind racing. The crew's attention to the decoy was unerringly exact, and he realized that any miscalculation in timing or positioning could reveal his presence. He ducked lower, letting the low-lying fog obscure his figure as the searchlights swept close to the channel. The decoy float bobbed on the surface, its line taut, signaling the path where the net would eventually wait. He adjusted his journal notes, marking the exact moments of patrol reaction, the vessel's acceleration, its course correction, and the time gap between detection and response. These were the measurements that would allow him to predict the enemy's behavior once the trap was fully set. By the end of the trial, Jonas understood both the potential and the peril of the hidden net. The patrols were not merely routine. They were highly responsive, tracking movement with a precision that bordered on instinct. Every shadow, every reflection, and every subtle change in the decoy's motion had been observed and countered. His plan would succeed only if timing, concealment, and environmental knowledge were executed flawlessly. The chapter closed with a tangible tension. The patrol vessel followed the decoy almost too closely, its presence a stark reminder that the margin for error was minimal. Jonas crouched behind the rocks, inhaling the salt-scented fog, and whispered to himself, "They are watching too well." The first test of his ingenuity had revealed both the enemy's skill and the necessity for absolute precision in the trap he was about to lay. The small wooden table in Jonas Marlow's hut was littered with sketches, rope samples, and weights. Candlelight flickered across chalk marks etched into black and white maps, tracing the contours of the cove and the hidden channel he had discovered days earlier. Each mark represented a tidal shift, a submerged rock, or a current that could either conceal or betray the hidden net. Jonas worked in silence, methodically aligning every detail with the patrol movements he had logged, calculating the exact moment the net would rise. He examined the ropes and weights he intended to use, testing tension and elasticity. A too light line would snap under a ship's hull, too heavy, and the net might rise prematurely, alerting the patrol. He experimented with pulleys concealed under jagged rocks, simulating the way a vessel's hull would engage a trigger line. Every adjustment was recorded, each angle tested against wave patterns and tidal currents. Jonas knew that timing was as crucial as placement. A miscalculation could render the trap useless or deadly to unintended targets. Maps spread across the table depicted not only the main patrol, but also hypothetical approaches. He drew lines representing multiple vessels moving simultaneously, calculating the net's capacity and the sequence of triggers required to ensnare each hull without tangling or failing. He noted shadows where moonlight reflected off the water, which could reveal ropes or floats, and adjusted anchor points accordingly. Each anchor point was chosen for both concealment and strength, using natural formations as cover and stabilizers. Simulations with small decoy floats and weighted lines allowed Jonas to approximate the net's behavior. He adjusted buoyancy to maintain proper submersion, ensuring that it remained invisible from a distance while still capable of lifting a vessel once triggered. Tidal timing was critical. The net had to be fully deployed only during high tide to reach the draft of the largest enemy vessels, yet remain dormant during low tide when local fishing boats traversed the channel. As the hours passed, Jonas's attention to detail became almost obsessive. He reviewed the patrol schedules again, comparing recorded times with environmental conditions. He adjusted for wind shifts, wave refraction, and the occasional fog that might alter visibility. The net had to be foolproof, calibrated to human observation and mechanical function alike. Every possible contingency, current variations, vessel speed, or patrol deviation, was plotted meticulously on his chalk maps. Then, during a late-night observation from the cliff, he noticed an anomaly. A small, previously untracked patrol vessel slipped along the outer edge of the bay, its movements calculated but absent from his records. The boat's presence was brief yet undeniable, gliding silently past rocks that had once been considered safe zones for his trap. Jonas's mind raced. The addition of this vessel meant that the net could no longer rely on a single sequence of triggers. He would have to accommodate simultaneous engagement, adjusting weights, line tension, and timing to ensure both vessels could be caught without detection or premature deployment. He leaned over the maps, redrawing lines, recalculating anchor distances, and adjusting pulley placements. The added patrol introduced new variables, currents interacting with one hull while another triggered an adjacent line, potential collision with rocks, and changes in wake patterns that might alert the crews. Every factor required precision. Misjudgment could betray the trap entirely. The candle burned low, casting long shadows across Jonas's chalk diagrams. He took a final measurement of line length, tide height, and estimated vessel draft, then whispered to himself, 2 vessels, 2 sequences, it must work flawlessly. His strategic plan had evolved from a single patrol ambush into a complex, dual-threat operation, integrating environmental intelligence, enemy behavior, and mechanical ingenuity. As the chapter closed, Jonas stood at the cliff edge, binoculars trained on the horizon. He traced the path of both patrols against the black and white silhouette of the bay, calculating in silence how the hidden net would rise. The presence of the second patrol had complicated the plan, but it had also sharpened his resolve. The trap was becoming a living system, responsive, precise, and deadly. Jonas realized the net must now be capable of ensnaring 2 vessels simultaneously, and any error would expose him or the entire operation. The moon hung low over the coastline, its muted light casting silver contours across the black and white waves. Jonas Marlow moved carefully along the rocks, a coil of weighted rope slung over his shoulder. This was the final phase of preparation, the installation of the hidden net, and it required darkness, low tide, and absolute silence. He carried no lantern. The moon's diffusion through the fog was enough to guide him. Any artificial light risked alerting the patrol vessels or curious locals. He reached the first anchor point near the submerged channel. The rocks here were jagged and naturally recessed, perfect for hiding the weighted knots and pulley fixtures he had engineered. Kneeling, Jonas tested each rock formation with slow, deliberate pressure, confirming stability before securing the rope. He threaded the line through a concealed metal ring he had embedded earlier, ensuring it sat below the waterline even at high tide. The rope blended into the dark surf, its texture chosen specifically to mimic kelp when wet. Jonas worked methodically. Each knot was tied with steady precision, and every anchor was double-checked for strength. He paused occasionally to study the tide's progression, calculating the net's tension during both the patrol's expected arrival and the shift from low tide to rising water. This phase was the most critical. The net had to remain invisible while lying dormant against the seafloor, yet be capable of rising with immense force when triggered. He tightened the main pulley line and tested it with a controlled tug. The concealed mechanism responded with muted resistance, exactly as intended. Too much tension would cause premature lift, too little would delay the trigger and risk failure. Jonas recorded the adjustment mentally, tracing the line's angle as it disappeared beneath the gray-black water. He moved along the shoreline to the second anchor, placing weights at precise depths to ensure uniform deployment. Local fishing equipment had been repurposed here: sinker stones, weathered net rings, and rope strands that blended seamlessly with ordinary gear. Nothing appeared out of place. The silence around him was broken only by the gentle pull of the tide and the distant call of nocturnal seabirds. Fog rolled low over the surface, emphasizing each shadow, each ripple. Jonas paused, listening for mechanical sounds, any hint that the patrol vessels had altered their schedule. The sea remained empty. He resumed work, securing the final anchor near the narrow channel's funnel point, ensuring the net sweep radius was wide enough to ensnare 2 vessels if needed. He stepped into knee-deep water to test the trigger line connected to a submerged tension bar. The cold bit sharply into his legs, but he ignored it, focusing on placement. He pulled the line once, lightly, just enough to gauge movement. The net lifted a fraction, then settled again, sinking invisibly into the channel. The mechanism worked. The trap was operational. Jonas exhaled slowly, preparing to gather his remaining tools, when a faint sound reached him: footsteps on wet rock. He froze. The tread was light, uncertain. A local fisherman, perhaps returning from checking tidal pools or stray nets. Jonas pressed himself against a shadowed ridge, careful not to disturb the ropes beneath the water. The footsteps came closer, stopping near the first anchor point he had secured. He watched through the fog as the silhouette paused, scanning the dark surf. One more step and the man would stand directly atop the concealed pulley. Jonas held his breath, resisting any movement. The fisherman lingered, listening to the tide, before turning away. The footsteps retreated slowly, echoing faintly between rock walls. Jonas remained motionless as the sound faded, aware that any further noise could still draw attention. The night was no longer silent. It throbbed with risk. As he reached for his tools, another set of footsteps echoed from the opposite direction, closer than before. The fog lay thick over the cove, swallowing the edges of the rocky coastline in a muted black and white haze. Jonas Marlow crouched on the crest of a low ridge, his binoculars trained on the distant patrol boats drifting along their routine path. He remained perfectly still, each breath measured, the damp cold pressing against his coat. The nets he had secured beneath the channel were silent, waiting, their mechanical precision reliant on the timing he had calculated down to the minute. He adjusted the focus on his binoculars, tracing the subtle flicker of lanterns on the decks. The German patrols moved with exacting regularity, but Jonas had noticed anomalies in previous nights, slight deviations that could betray the location of his hidden net or prevent its proper triggering. Tonight, he needed to confirm everything: the angle of the tide, the time of patrol passage, and the readiness of his concealed mechanism. The metallic thrum of engines echoed faintly over the fog-shrouded water. Jonas' ears, attuned to subtle vibrations, noted the difference between hull resonance in calm tide versus rising currents. He traced the faint hum, mapping it in his mind against the physical positions of the boats. A low lantern beam swept across the water, glinting off the wet surfaces of buoys and rocks, giving him a reference for the patrol's orientation relative to his net. Each flash of light had to align precisely with the net's sweep. Any discrepancy could trigger failure. He consulted the tidal charts once more, whispered aloud to himself, confirming the rise of the incoming tide. Even a slight miscalculation could leave the net too low to entangle the patrols or too high, risking premature exposure. Jonas adjusted the small weights attached to the submerged lines in his mental plan, considering the minor deviations in current from the storm 3 days prior. Hours passed in quiet vigilance. Every dip of a hull, every mechanical hiss, was catalogued and compared to expected patterns. The patrols, unaware of the meticulous scrutiny from the ridge, followed their habitual loops, but Jonas detected an imperfection. One boat, a smaller craft trailing the main formation, veered slightly toward the center of the channel, brushing against the edge of the submerged rocks that he had relied upon as anchors for the net. A cold tension gripped him. A deviation of only a few meters could compromise the trap's efficiency. The timing, the alignment of the pulleys, the slope of the tide, all depended on exact positioning. He whispered under his breath, "Adjust, or it fails." The words seemed to dissolve into the fog, unheard by anyone but himself. Jonas' fingers traced the binocular frame, a subtle tactile reminder to remain motionless. He shifted neither body nor shadow, listening intently to the synchronized clicks of the patrol's lanterns and the muffled hiss of engines. The rhythm was familiar, yet tonight it was laced with a new variable. He recalculated, mentally simulating the net's deployment as the errant patrol craft approached the channel. Each pulse of the hull, every reflected lantern beam, became a cue in a sequence he had rehearsed silently for days. The trap could still work, but it required split-second timing and absolute trust in his preparations. The fog thickened further, reducing visibility to mere meters along the rocky shore. The mirrored reflection of lanterns in the undulating water offered fleeting glimpses of the patrol's course. Jonas' eyes scanned them meticulously, noting a slight shift in trajectory. Any misalignment here would force him to make a rapid decision, adjusting either weights or tension with minimal movement, a delicate dance he had planned for but hoped never to execute. The patrol's slight deviation forced him to acknowledge the first real threat to the trap's precision. He pressed himself lower into the shadow of the ridge, whispering once more, "Adjust, or it fails," as the unseen currents began to move with unpredictable force. The fog clung to the channel, a rolling gray mass that muted the sound of waves and shrouded Jonas' vantage point. From his perch on the cliff edge, he tracked the lead patrol boat, its hull cutting silently through the darkened water. Every preparation, every calculation of tide and anchor converged in this precise moment. As the vessel entered the hidden channel, the net lay beneath the surface, invisible against the blackened water. Weighted anchors held it taut, while buoyant corks and ropes ensured the trap remained concealed until engagement. Jonas' eyes followed the subtle rise in the bow as the vessel's keel passed above the submerged mechanism. The first cables tightened with a near imperceptible snap, and the net rose, wrapping around the propeller and rudder. Engines strained immediately. The metallic groan of pistons under stress echoed faintly across the fog, a muted but telling signal to Jonas. The lead crew scrambled to reverse, their movements coordinated yet frantic, shouting commands over the clatter of failing machinery. Water churned white along the sides of the hull, tossing spray onto the deck as men attempted to cut the net manually. Every tug and jerk only tightened the trap further. Jonas observed each detail clinically. The weights anchored in the channel floor held firm. The ropes maintained exact tension. The net's mesh prevented propeller rotation while resisting tearing. The lead vessel, its bow slightly tilting as water resistance built, became immobilized. Engines roared, pistons rattled, and the crew's panic escalated. Yet the ship remained caught, an unyielding captive of a mechanism born from observation and patient calculation. He noted the tactical reactions of the crew. Officers shouted orders, sailors leaped to the sides to avoid the rising net, and hatches slammed as if their noise alone could counteract the mechanical reality below. Jonas cataloged each movement, not in alarm, but in forensic detail: how trained personnel responded to sudden immobilization, how panic displaced protocol, and how mechanical ingenuity dictated the pace of chaos. Then the unexpected: a trailing patrol boat, previously untracked, accelerated down the channel. Its hull cut through the water at a rate that would intersect with the trapped vessel if uncorrected. Engines hummed a low, rising pitch, signaling imminent collision. The panic aboard the lead ship became amplified, sailors gesturing wildly, shouting incoherently over the spray and clamor. Jonas' pulse remained steady. His mind raced with contingency calculations. The timing of the tidal current and the positioning of the net left no room for error. The channel's narrow width funneled both vessels directly into the trap zone. Jonas recognized the compounded danger. If the second boat struck the immobilized ship, the mechanical strain on both hulls would risk hull breach or even capsizing. The net's ropes, while strong, could tear under combined force, and the precise concealment could be exposed, compromising future operations along the coast. From his cliffside observation, Jonas prepared mentally for the next step. His hands rested lightly on his notebook, ready to record or signal adjustments if necessary, while his mind calculated every possible vector of force, every shift in current, and every second before collision. The quiet fog muted human panic into ghostly movement. The waves themselves seemed frozen in suspense. The second vessel bore down on the trapped lead ship, engines humming dangerously. Jonas realized that only immediate action, or a stroke of timing as precise as the net's mechanics, could prevent a catastrophic collision. The fog had thickened across the bay, rolling in low and heavy, muting sound and blurring light. Jonas Marlow crouched behind the jagged rocks of the northern cliff, his eyes tracking the second patrol vessel that now cut a direct line toward the trapped lead ship. Timing was critical. Even a slight miscalculation could result in collision or reveal the net's presence. He adjusted the tide-sensitive anchors with careful precision. The weighted ropes had been designed to allow minor manipulations, and Jonas had anticipated the second vessel's trajectory. With a flick of his wrist and a subtle repositioning of a small buoy, he altered the net's tension just enough to guide the vessel into the channel without snagging prematurely. Each adjustment relied on calculations of water flow, current velocity, and vessel mass. Meanwhile, small decoys floated upstream, barely visible against the fog. They were simple, buoyant scraps of wood rigged to pull a thin line and create motion on the water's surface, but their effectiveness lay in their unpredictability. The second patrol's sensors and crew, scanning for movement, reacted instinctively to these minor disturbances, subtly adjusting their course without realizing the manipulation. Jonas noted the faint vibrations along the hull of the second boat and interpreted them as confirmation. The vessel was aligning perfectly with the hidden net below. He coordinated these adjustments with the fog itself. Shifting shadows and drifting mist concealed minor movements, masking the mechanical noises of the net and anchors. Each second felt elongated, each observation critical. Jonas' hands remained steady as he traced lines of sight, calculated angles of approach, and anticipated the vessel's throttle changes, all while remaining hidden in the black and white silhouette of the rocky shoreline. The second patrol's bow slid into the channel with startling precision. The submerged net responded exactly as designed. Weighted anchors held firm. Ropes rose just enough to ensnare the propeller and rudder without alerting the crew prematurely. Engines strained against resistance, but there was no violent lurch, no frantic exposure. Jonas' split-second decisions and environmental manipulations had paid off. The second vessel was immobilized, trapped in silent chaos, without any sign that the first ship had been involved. As dawn lifted higher, the fog thinned, revealing distant sails and the occasional flicker of a patrol light far beyond the bay. Jonas crouched briefly by the water, observing the minor wave patterns once more. The hidden net beneath the channel remained poised, its potential energy silent yet formidable. The patrols might return, the lesson would be tested again, but for now, the village breathed, the coastline endured, and Jonas' watch continued without notice. Jonas allowed himself a faint, reflective smile as he noted the gentle ripple of the waves, a subtle reminder that the hidden net could yet spring to life. The story closed without conclusion, leaving open the possibility that the coast's unseen guardian might protect it again or inspire another hidden defender to take up the legacy.